The studio lights were already burning hot when Bruce Lee stepped through the backstage door. It was a summer evening in 1973, and the atmosphere inside NBC's Burbank studio was louder than usual. Technicians hurried across the floor. Producers whispered into headsets. Camera operators adjusted their positions. The audience laughed and talked among themselves as they waited for the next guest. But behind the curtain, there was a different kind of silence. Bruce Lee stood alone for a moment. He was dressed simply, but there was something about the way he carried himself that made people look twice. He wasn't the biggest man in the building. He wasn't wearing a superhero costume. He wasn't surrounded by bodyguards. Yet almost everyone backstage knew exactly who he was. The man who had turned martial arts into something millions of Americans wanted to understand. The man whose name was beginning to appear everywhere. And tonight, in this imagined version of history, he was about to walk onto Johnny Carson's famous late-night stage. Bruce took a slow breath. He heard the audience applauding for the previous segment. Then someone approached him. "Mr. Lee." Bruce turned. It was one of the show's producers. "Johnny is ready for you." Bruce nodded. The producer hesitated before walking away. Then he looked back. "Oh, one more thing." Bruce raised an eyebrow. "Johnny has something planned." Bruce smiled. "That's dangerous." The producer laughed nervously. "You might want to ask him what it is." Bruce simply shook his head. "No." The producer looked confused. Bruce continued. "If I know what he is planning, it won't be a surprise anymore." And with that, Bruce walked toward the stage. The curtain opened. The audience erupted. Johnny Carson sat behind his famous desk, smiling as he watched Bruce Lee enter. Bruce waved politely. Carson stood and shook his hand. "Bruce Lee." The applause grew even louder. Bruce smiled. "Thank you." Carson looked toward the audience. "I have to tell you something. This man has been making people nervous all over Hollywood." The crowd laughed. Bruce raised his eyebrows. Carson continued. "I've heard stories about him." Bruce sat down. "What kind of stories?" Carson leaned toward him. "Well, I've heard you can break boards." Bruce nodded. "Sometimes." "I've heard you can kick extremely fast." "Sometimes." "And I've heard you can make grown men cry." The audience laughed. Bruce smiled. "Only if they deserve it." The crowd exploded. Carson leaned back, laughing. For several minutes, the conversation was light. Carson asked Bruce about movies. Bruce talked about martial arts. They discussed training, discipline, acting, and Hollywood. But then Carson changed his tone. He looked toward the side of the stage. "Actually, Bruce." Bruce noticed immediately. Something had changed. Carson continued. "I brought something for you." An assistant walked onto the stage, carrying a long black case. The audience became curious. Bruce watched the case approach. The assistant placed it on the desk. Carson opened it. Inside was a pair of Nunchaku. The audience reacted immediately. Some people applauded. Others laughed nervously. Carson picked them up. "So," he said, "they tell me these are what make you dangerous." Bruce stared at the Nunchaku. Then he looked at Carson. "Who told you that?" Carson laughed. "I have sources." Bruce smiled. He reached out. Carson handed them over. Bruce held them loosely. For a moment, nothing happened. The studio became unusually quiet. Bruce looked at the audience. then at Carson, and finally at the weapon in his hands. Would you like me to demonstrate? Carson smiled. That's why they're here. Bruce nodded. He stood. The audience watched. At first, his movements were slow. He rotated one handle. The chain moved gently through his fingers. Then another movement. A little faster. Then faster. The sound changed. What had been a soft, metallic clicking became a rapid rhythm. Bruce's arms moved with astonishing precision. The nunchaku seemed to disappear and reappear around his body. The audience gasped. Bruce suddenly stopped. Silence. He looked at Carson. Carson stared at him. Then he looked toward the audience. Well, the audience laughed. Carson shook his head. I suddenly feel very comfortable behind this desk. Bruce laughed. The crowd applauded. But Carson wasn't finished. He had seen demonstrations before. He wanted something more. Something nobody expected. He leaned forward. Bruce, can you do that without looking? Bruce paused. Then he smiled. Without looking. Yes. Bruce looked down at the nunchaku. Then he slowly closed his eyes. The audience reacted with nervous laughter. Bruce stood perfectly still. Carson watched him carefully. Bruce raised the nunchaku. One movement. Then another. The chain snapped through the air. The speed increased. The audience became silent. Bruce continued with his eyes closed. Then, clang! The nunchaku struck a metal microphone stand. The entire studio jumped. Bruce stopped instantly. The microphone stand trembled. For 1 second, nobody said anything. Then Bruce opened his eyes. He looked at the microphone. Then at Carson. Carson slowly leaned toward the microphone. I think the microphone just apologized. The audience erupted. Bruce laughed. The tension disappeared. But something had changed. Everyone in that room had just witnessed something they couldn't explain. And Bruce knew it. He lowered the nunchaku. This is not about speed, he said. Carson looked at him. Then what is it about? Bruce's expression became serious. Control. The audience became quiet again. Bruce continued. Anyone can move fast. He held up the nunchaku. But if you don't control your movement, speed means nothing. Carson nodded. Bruce placed the nunchaku on the desk. Martial arts is not only about fighting. What is it about? Bruce thought for a moment. Understanding yourself. There was no joke. No punchline. Just silence. For a moment, Johnny Carson wasn't the comedian asking questions. He was simply listening. And Bruce Lee wasn't the movie star people had come to see. He was a man trying to explain something he had spent his entire life learning. A quick question for everyone watching. If you were sitting in that studio, would you have wanted Bruce Lee to demonstrate the nunchaku again? Yes, show us more. No, that was already enough. And before we continue, hit the like button if you enjoy stories about legendary moments that feel almost too incredible to be true. Subscribe for more stories like this and tell us in the comments where you're watching from right now. I want to know how far this story has traveled. Back on the stage, Johnny Carson was still thinking about Bruce's answer. He picked up the nunchaku. Control, he repeated. Bruce nodded. That's right. Carson looked at the audience. Well, I think I have a new problem. Bruce smiled. What problem? I've spent years trying to control this show." The audience laughed. "But now I'm wondering if I can control you." Bruce laughed. "Try." Carson's eyes widened. The audience reacted immediately. Johnny Carson stood. "You heard him." He turned toward backstage. "Bring out the challenge." Bruce looked surprised. "Challenge?" Carson smiled. "Remember, I told you I had something planned." Bruce nodded slowly. A man walked onto the stage. He was tall, athletic, and confident. The audience applauded. Bruce watched him carefully. The man approached. Carson introduced him as a professional martial artist. The man shook Bruce's hand. Then he said something unexpected. "I've seen your movies." Bruce smiled. "Thank you." The man continued. "They're impressive." A pause. "But movies aren't real fighting." The laughter disappeared. Bruce looked at him. The man wasn't smiling. Carson looked between them. For a moment, nobody knew what Bruce would do. Bruce simply nodded. "You're right." The man looked surprised. "You agree?" Bruce smiled. "Movies are movies." The man crossed his arms. "So what happens when the cameras stop?" Bruce looked toward Carson. Then back at the man. "Then we don't need to fight." The man frowned. "What do you mean?" Bruce stepped backward. "Try to touch me." The audience reacted. Carson's eyebrows rose. "That's it." Bruce nodded. "That's it." The man laughed. "Where?" Bruce pointed toward his shoulder. "Anywhere." The man stood ready. Bruce relaxed. His arms hung naturally. His feet barely moved. Carson watched from a few feet away. "All right," Carson said. "Go." The man stepped forward. Bruce moved. Only slightly. The man's hand missed. The audience laughed. The man tried again. Bruce moved backward. Again. Missed. Again. Bruce shifted sideways. The audience began to understand. This wasn't a fight. It was something stranger. The man increased his speed. Bruce didn't. He simply moved at the right moment. One step. One turn. One tiny adjustment. The man's fingers came within inches of Bruce's shoulder, but never touched it. Carson stood frozen. The man tried one final time. He moved quickly. Bruce stepped forward. The man's hand stopped. Bruce's fingers were already resting lightly against the man's wrist. "Silence." Bruce released him immediately. The man looked down at his wrist. Then at Bruce. There was no anger on his face now. Only disbelief. Bruce said quietly, "You were trying to catch me." The man nodded. Bruce smiled. "You forgot to watch where I was going." The audience exploded with applause. Johnny Carson laughed. He walked toward Bruce. "I think we've learned something tonight." Bruce looked at him. "What?" Carson smiled. "Never challenge the quiet guy." Everyone laughed. But beneath the laughter was something deeper. Respect. The martial artist who had challenged Bruce extended his hand again. This time, there was no doubt in his expression. Bruce shook it. The man whispered, "You're different." Bruce replied, "We are all different." Then he turned toward the audience. "The important thing is learning what you can become." The applause grew louder. And somewhere in that room, someone realized they weren't simply watching a television guest. They were watching a man who was changing how America thought about martial arts. But Johnny Carson had one final question. And Bruce Lee had no idea that this question would make the entire mood of the studio change. Carson returned to his desk. He sat down. Bruce sat across from him. Carson removed his glasses. Then he asked quietly, "Bruce." Bruce looked at him. "With everything happening to you right now, with the movies, the attention, the success, what do you really want people to remember?" Bruce didn't answer immediately. The studio became completely silent. He looked toward the audience, then at his hands. Finally, he said, "I don't want them to remember how fast I was." Carson listened. "I don't want them to remember how hard I could hit." Another pause. "I want them to remember that they don't have to become someone else." The audience didn't laugh. Nobody moved. Bruce continued. "People spend too much time trying to become what others expect." He looked directly toward the camera. "Be yourself." Carson nodded slowly. Bruce smiled. "That's the hardest thing." The applause began softly. Then it grew and grew until the entire studio was standing. Bruce Lee looked almost embarrassed by the attention. He bowed his head. Johnny Carson stood beside him. For once, Carson didn't make a joke. He simply shook Bruce's hand and said, "I think America is going to remember you." Bruce smiled. Neither man knew how haunting those words would become. Because outside that fictional television studio, history was moving toward a tragedy nobody could stop. Bruce Lee's life was approaching its final weeks. The world thought his greatest years were still ahead. Hollywood believed he was only beginning. Millions of people believed they would watch Bruce Lee make movies for decades. But history had another plan. And that is what made the applause inside that studio so heartbreaking. The audience believed they were watching the beginning of a legend. They didn't know they were watching one of his final moments. The cameras kept rolling. The lights stayed bright. The audience continued applauding. And Bruce Lee stood beneath the television lights with a small smile on his face. For just a few seconds, everything seemed perfect. Then Carson's voice came through the studio. "Bruce, thank you for being here." Bruce nodded. "Thank you for having me." The applause returned. Bruce turned toward the audience. He bowed. And as the curtain slowly began to close, Johnny Carson watched him disappear backstage. Neither man knew that the image of Bruce Lee walking away would become more powerful than any demonstration. Because sometimes, history's most painful moments are not the ones where something goes wrong. They are the moments when everything appears to be going perfectly, just before the world changes forever. The applause followed Bruce Lee all the way backstage. He could still hear it through the curtain. Thousands of tiny sounds blended together, the clapping of hands, laughter, voices calling his name. Bruce stopped for a moment. He looked back toward the stage. Johnny Carson was already returning to his desk. The cameras were moving. The next segment was beginning. And yet Bruce remained still. There was something strange about the moment. He had performed before crowds much larger than this. He had fought in front of people. He had acted in movies. He had demonstrated martial arts to Hollywood stars, producers, and athletes. But tonight felt different. Maybe it was the simplicity of it. There had been no movie set, no special effects, no carefully choreographed fight scene. Just Bruce Lee, a pair of nunchaku, and a room full of people who had suddenly realized that the man they had seen on screen was even more extraordinary in person. A production assistant approached. "Mr. Lee." Bruce turned. "Yes. Johnny wants to speak with you before you leave." Bruce nodded. "All right." The assistant disappeared. Bruce looked down at his hands. Then he heard a familiar voice behind him. "You're making me look bad." Bruce turned. Johnny Carson was standing there. Bruce smiled. "I thought you looked pretty good." Carson laughed. "That's not what the audience thought." Bruce laughed. For a moment, the two men simply stood there. Then Carson's expression became more serious. "That demonstration." Bruce waited. "I've seen a lot of performers," Carson said, "but I've never seen anyone move like that." Bruce shrugged. "Years of practice." "How many years?" Bruce thought about it. "Most of my life." Carson nodded. Then he asked something unexpected. "Do you ever get tired of proving yourself?" Bruce looked at him. The question was different from all the others. There was no joke behind it. Bruce slowly nodded. "Sometimes." Carson waited. Bruce continued. "When people see something they don't understand, they want you to prove it again. Again. Again, faster, harder, bigger." He smiled faintly. "But that's not why I train." "Why do you train?" Bruce looked toward the empty stage. "Because there is always something I don't understand about myself." Carson was quiet. Bruce continued. "Every day I discover a weakness. And you fix it." "Sometimes." Carson smiled. "And the other times?" Bruce laughed. "Then I discover another weakness." Carson shook his head. "You're making philosophy sound exhausting." Bruce laughed. "Maybe it is." They both smiled. But neither noticed the young production assistant standing several feet away. He had been listening. And years later, he would remember that conversation more clearly than the Nunchaku demonstration itself. Because Bruce Lee wasn't talking like a celebrity. He was talking like a man who knew that fame could disappear overnight. Outside the studio, Los Angeles was glowing beneath the night sky. Cars moved through the streets. Billboards illuminated Hollywood. Bruce's face was beginning to appear on posters everywhere. His name was becoming bigger. His opportunities were growing. And yet Bruce knew something the audience didn't. Fame had never been his real destination. He wanted something else. He wanted freedom. Freedom from limitations. Freedom from labels. Freedom from the expectations of other people. And perhaps most importantly, freedom from fear. Here's a question for everyone watching. If you could ask Bruce Lee one question tonight, what would it be? Would you ask him about fighting, his movies, his training? Or would you ask him about the philosophy behind everything he did? Write your question in the comments. And if you're enjoying this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and tell us where you're watching from. Are you watching from the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, India, Pakistan, Uzbekistan, or somewhere else? Write your country or city below. Back inside the studio, the night continued. But Bruce's appearance was becoming the topic everyone was talking about. People backstage were repeating what they had just seen. One camera operator told another. "I couldn't even follow his hands." A stagehand replied. "I wasn't watching his hands." "What were you watching?" "His feet." "And I couldn't follow those either." They laughed. But there was genuine amazement behind their jokes. Bruce had made something extremely difficult look effortless. And that was precisely what made him dangerous to underestimate. A few minutes later, Bruce was preparing to leave. He picked up his jacket. Then Johnny Carson appeared again. Bruce. Bruce turned. Yes. I have one more idea. Bruce smiled. I knew you would. Carson pointed toward the studio. Come back out. Bruce raised an eyebrow. Why? I want to try something. What? Carson grinned. You'll find out. Bruce laughed. You really enjoy surprises. That's television. Bruce followed him. The cameras were still positioned. The audience had no idea Bruce was coming back. When the curtain opened again, people gasped. Then the applause started. Bruce walked toward Carson's desk. Carson stood. Apparently, he told the audience, we're not done with him yet. Bruce sat down. Carson leaned toward him. I want to ask you about something. Bruce nodded. Go ahead. People think martial artists are supposed to be fearless. Bruce shook his head. No. The answer came immediately. Carson looked surprised. No. Bruce shook his head again. Fear is normal. The audience became quiet. Bruce continued. The mistake is believing you should never feel it. Carson leaned closer. So what should you do? Bruce looked directly at him. Understand it. Understand fear. Yes. Bruce explained that fear could be useful. It could tell you when something was wrong. It could make you alert. It could make you faster. But fear became dangerous when you allowed it to control your decisions. Carson nodded. So courage isn't having no fear. Bruce smiled. No. What is it? Bruce answered. Moving forward while you have it. The audience applauded. Carson looked at Bruce for several seconds. Then he said, That's a pretty good answer. Bruce smiled. You asked a good question. The audience laughed. Carson pointed at him. Don't get too comfortable, I'm still the host. Bruce laughed. Then Carson suddenly stood. He picked up an ordinary object from his desk. A pencil. He held it up. Can you break this? The audience laughed. Bruce stared at the pencil. Then at Carson. I could. Carson smiled. But. Bruce shook his head. But why? The audience laughed again. Carson nodded. Exactly. Bruce took the pencil. He examined it. Then placed it carefully back on the desk. Breaking something isn't difficult. Carson asked. Then what is difficult? Bruce looked toward the audience. Knowing when not to. Silence. Those words landed differently. The show had begun as entertainment. Now it was becoming something else. Bruce wasn't simply showing people what he could do. He was showing them what he believed. And that distinction mattered. Because there was a world outside the television studio that wanted Bruce Lee to become a symbol. Hollywood wanted an action star. Movie studios wanted a bankable name. Audiences wanted a fighter. Critics wanted to know whether he was truly as powerful as the legends suggested. But Bruce wanted people to understand that martial arts was not about violence. It was about discipline, control, awareness, and the ability to remain calm when everything around you became chaotic. Carson looked toward the camera. I think we've accidentally turned this into a philosophy class. The audience laughed. Bruce smiled. Maybe America needs one. The laughter became applause. Carson shook his head. All right, before you completely take over my show. Bruce laughed. I have one last challenge. Bruce looked at him. Again. Again. Carson pointed toward backstage. An assistant appeared, carrying a wooden board. The audience reacted immediately. Bruce looked at the board. Then at Carson. Carson said, "Everyone wants to see you break something." Bruce nodded. Of course. Carson handed him the board. Bruce examined it. Then he looked at the audience. He didn't immediately strike. Instead, he asked for the lights to be lowered. The audience became quiet. Bruce positioned the board. He took a breath. His expression changed. The playful television guest disappeared. The martial artist returned. His body became completely still. Then, crack! The board split. The audience exploded. Bruce didn't celebrate. He simply handed the pieces to Carson. Carson stared at them. That's it. Bruce nodded. That's it. Carson looked disappointed. I thought there would be smoke. Bruce laughed. Maybe next time. The audience laughed. But then Carson noticed something. Bruce's hand was slightly red. You hurt yourself. Bruce looked at his hand. No. Are you sure? Bruce nodded. It's nothing. Carson stared at him. Bruce smiled. Really? Carson wasn't convinced. But the cameras were rolling. The show moved forward. The audience applauded. And nobody knew that Bruce's body was already under enormous strain. His schedule was relentless. Training, filming, writing, meetings, travel, interviews. He barely stopped. His ambition pushed him forward. But the human body has limits. Even Bruce Lee's. Later that night, after the show ended, Bruce walked outside. The cool Los Angeles air touched his face. He looked up. The city was still awake. Carson came outside behind him. Bruce. Bruce turned. Yes. Carson stood beside him. For a few seconds, neither man spoke. Then Carson said, You know, when you first came out tonight, I thought we'd just have some fun. Bruce smiled. So did I. But you surprised me. Bruce looked toward the city. How? Carson thought. You made everyone stop laughing. Bruce smiled. Was that good? Carson laughed. Very. Then Carson became serious. I mean it. Bruce nodded. Thank you. Carson extended his hand. Bruce shook it. Then Carson said something that Bruce would remember. Take care of yourself. Bruce smiled. I will. Carson walked back inside. Bruce remained outside. He watched the lights of Los Angeles. He didn't know what the future held. He didn't know how quickly his life would change. He didn't know that the movie about to make him internationally famous would soon transform him into a global icon. And he certainly didn't know that his life would end before he had the chance to see the full impact of what he had created. At that moment, Bruce simply stood there. A young man in a city that never stopped moving. A man with dreams larger than Hollywood. A man who believed that limitations existed mostly in the mind. He smiled. Then he walked toward his car. The studio lights disappeared behind him. But the image of Bruce Lee standing beneath them remained burned into the memories of everyone who had witnessed that extraordinary night. And somewhere inside that television studio, a camera had captured every second. The laughter, the silence, the nunchaku, the broken board, the questions, the philosophy, the smile. Nobody knew it yet. But someday, people would look back at moments like this and realize something heartbreaking. Bruce Lee wasn't just demonstrating what the human body could do. He was showing the world how much life could be packed into a very short amount of time. And the night wasn't over yet. Because before Bruce left Los Angeles, one final question was waiting for him. A question that would force him to talk about the one thing he almost never discussed on television: death. The studio was almost empty now. The audience had gone home. The cameras had been switched off. The bright television lights that had made everything feel larger than life were slowly disappearing. Bruce Lee stood near the backstage door, ready to leave. Then Johnny Carson approached him one last time. "Bruce." Bruce turned. Carson smiled. "Can I ask you something I didn't ask on camera?" Bruce nodded. "Of course." Carson looked at him for a moment. "Are you afraid of anything?" Bruce didn't answer immediately. He looked down at the floor. Then he said quietly, "Yes." Carson seemed surprised. "Really?" Bruce nodded. "Everyone is. What are you afraid of?" Bruce looked toward the empty stage. "Not having enough time." Carson became silent. Bruce continued. "People think they have forever, so they wait." "Wait for what?" "To become better, to follow their dream, to tell someone they love them, to do what they really want." He paused. "But time doesn't wait." Carson stared at him. Bruce smiled faintly. "That's why I try to live now." For once, Johnny Carson had no joke. He simply extended his hand. Bruce shook it. "Take care of yourself," Carson said again. Bruce smiled. "I will." Then he walked away. The doors closed behind him. And Johnny Carson remained there for a few seconds, staring at the empty hallway. He couldn't have known how powerful those words would become. Because Bruce Lee's time really was running short. Only weeks later, the world would lose the man who had seemed unstoppable. His death would shock millions. His films would become legendary. His philosophy would reach generations he would never meet. And that imagined night on Carson's stage would live forever as a symbol of what might have been. A television audience, expecting a spectacular martial arts demonstration, had instead received something much more powerful. A lesson about control. A lesson about courage. And finally, a lesson about time. One last question for everyone watching. If Bruce Lee was sitting across from you right now, what would you tell him? Write it in the comments. And if this story touched you, like the video, subscribe, and tell us where you're watching from. Write your country or city in the comments so we can see how many places around the world are listening to Bruce Lee's story. The final image is simple. Bruce Lee walks through the dark Los Angeles night. The city lights reflect across the windshield of his car. Behind him, the television studio slowly disappears. Ahead of him is an uncertain future. He doesn't know how little time remains. He doesn't know how famous he will become. He doesn't know that his name will one day be spoken by people who weren't even born when he was alive. He simply drives into the night. And perhaps that is the most important part of the story. Because Bruce Lee didn't know how much time he had. But he understood something most people discover too late. You don't need to know how much time you have to make the time you have matter. The lights of Lowe's angels disappear into the distance. And the legend begins.